I'm here this morning with Jamie Monson, who is a professor of history at Macalester College in Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota. And we're here talking about her new research on the relationship between Tanzania and China during the Cold War, the involvement of China in building a really important railway in Tanzania during that period. This is a perfect fit for our theme of transnational histories and the transnational turn, and I want to welcome you to the University of South Carolina. So Jamie, your research has taken you from Tanzania to China and recently to Burma, which has been just a fascinating global journey for you and for your research, and a perfect fit for our theme of the transnational turn. But before we start talking about these new interests that have taken you into so many different places, I'd like to begin by just asking you how you got involved with Tanzania and how your interests in East Africa originally evolved.
It's really great to be here, and I'm really excited that your department and your university are investigating the idea of transnational and global histories.
Mm-hmm.
So my story goes back to when I graduated from Stanford after finishing my BA there in the late 1970s, and I joined the Peace Corps and went to Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
And just got so interested in East Africa and decided that I wanted to have a career that could take me back there and learn as much about East Africa as I could. So I went to graduate school, did a master's in rural development studies, a lot of geography, a lot of anthropology, and eventually made my way into history. And then when my graduate advisor, Ned Alpers, said, well, what do you think you want to do for your PhD? We kind of figured out that I had a minor in German from Stanford, and I knew fluent Swahili from living in Kenya, and those really come together in Tanzanian history because it was a German colony and I had the German background, and then I had the Swahili and East African experience. So I got interested in Tanzania from that point, and that became the topic of my dissertation. And then, because in Peace Corps I had been an agriculture volunteer and lived in rural villages really for over 2 years, I was very interested in farming and environmental issues and land, all of these kind of rural topics that had been part of my daily life in Peace Corps. So slowly but surely I gravitated into the field of environmental history, starting in the history of farming and agriculture, history of colonial development schemes, and then eventually environment, and so I became an environmental historian of East Africa.
So Jamie, when did China come into the picture then in your research?
Well, so my earlier research was on colonial East Africa, German East Africa, into the British period.
Mm-hmm.
So in the late 1990s, I was thinking of turning my dissertation into a book. So I went back to southern Tanzania where I had done my work before, and I was trying to figure out, what kind of landscape change or environmental change, livelihood changes were most important that I could really focus on for the book project.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm thinking about this, I'm riding the train, up and down the Kilimanjaro Valley.
Right.
And then all of a sudden a light went on, oh my God, this train brought more change and was more transformational really than almost anything else that I had ever known about that region. And I thought, well, could I write a book about this train? And I wasn't sure, and so it took me a while even to decide to write the first book about the train, which, as I said yesterday during my talk, I really was sure that it would be quite difficult, if not impossible, to do a Chinese component.
Mm-hmm.
So as that book was coming to a close, I got invited to go to China to give a talk. And while I was there, just got so much encouragement to do the Chinese piece. And then, amazingly, in 2007, a Singaporean student at Carleton and we went together on a research trip to China for the summer just to see whether it would be possible to find some of these old workers. And sure enough, we found about 7 Chinese workers that had gone to Africa who were not only willing but really excited to talk to me and tell me their stories. And then I still wasn't sure if I could like actually learn Chinese. So I met this very adventurous journalist friend of mine, Howard French, in Shanghai. And he said, of course you can learn Chinese. It's so easy.
That's not what I've heard.
I know. He said, don't worry. He says, yeah, don't even try, to write the character. Don't worry about the characters. He says, don't even worry about the tones. Just you can learn Chinese. It's not that hard. So I believed Howard, and I went back to Carleton and enrolled in Chinese 101. I took first-year Chinese in the classroom, and then after that did summer courses and lived in Beijing for a year. And learning Chinese is quite hard. It's challenging. But I fell in love with learning Chinese. It's one of my favorite pastimes, is taking Chinese. And so then after that, I started working more and more in China and decided to make this book really both the Chinese and the African stories together.
And that really comes out in the presentation that you gave, how you're able to tell both sides of the story of the building of this railway. I've heard you've been also doing some work in Burma. Has that just been personal travel, or might that also be part of your research agenda?
It's not part of my research, but it's part of my professional life.
Okay.
I started going there when I was living in China. I went there for on and off for a period of several months. Ended up teaching for a semester, teaching English, and teaching another course that I've taught at Carleton and McAllister on the ethics of volunteer service. So that's another part of my professional life, but there are some really interesting parallels. So, Southeast Asia has long had a Chinese presence, and Burma or Myanmar today has a lot of Chinese investment, a lot of infrastructure development. So it would be a topic I might want to work on at some point in the future, I think. But politically, it's much more difficult to work there. It would be challenging, I think, especially to take up that Chinese relationship. But one of the things that's so interesting is that as I've worked on the Chinese side of the railway story, learning that most of the Chinese workers that went to Africa came from the Southwest, from Chengdu and from Sichuan area, has taken me into Southwest China, which is, of course, right over the border from Burma.
Right.
And then there are all these other linkages with the Burma Road project from the Second World War, technology work that was done during the Vietnam War across the border. So even though I'm not working in Southeast Asia, it's a huge part of my current work. In fact, at the moment, I'm having to do some research on the Vietnam War just because it's something I didn't know a lot about, and the link between all the railways of the Southwest and Vietnam is quite important.
We should take one step back, I realize, and also I didn't realize how influential China was in East Africa. And during the time period you're looking at, the 60s and 70s mostly. So can you tell us a little bit about how China came to have such influence in East Africa, how they decided to want to help their government build this railway, through the center of the country and into Zambia in the first place?
Yeah, well, so China's interest in East Africa, I think many historians would trace it back to China's very early relationship with Zanzibar. And the interest in Zanzibar in pursuing a kind of socialist path to development and decolonization. And there were some important figures in Zanzibar, like Ali Hassan Isa is one who spent a lot of time in China. His wife also, Abdul Rahman Babu, was another important leader in Zanzibar that had a very close relationship with China. So I think many historians would probably see Zanzibar as sort of lead as one factor. But China was connected to many kind of nationalist intellectual leaders, in particular people like Nkrumah were interested in China. Pan-Africanism was a big theme in the China-Africa relationship, going back to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. So people like Julius Nyerere, who were Pan-Africanists, leading intellectuals interested in alternative, non-alignment kinds of models, these were the kinds of people that China developed early relationships with. And so when I think Tanzania and Zambia had this railway is really a Pan-African railway, because it joins Tanzania and Zambia, and Kenneth Kaunda said that it would break them free from the balkanization of colonialism. You know, it was very much a Pan-African vision. So I think many of those political aspects attracted China to working with those two countries to develop the railway.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It didn't hurt that the West had turned it down, so it gave China again this opportunity to say, oh, the West, you know, is turning away from the Pan-Africanist dreams of African countries, and we're here to facilitate them and their kind of liberation strategy.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the film that's accompanying this larger project, which I know will eventually be a book, but you're also doing a documentary film. So can you tell us a little bit about how you came to decide to, you know, work on it as a film project and make the ties in order to make that happen, because that's another fascinating dimension.
Yeah, and the film project really came about organically, kind of out of the work itself. So it's another wild story. You know, my Chinese teacher in Beijing had a roommate who was a young and very creative documentary filmmaker for CCTV, the Chinese public television station. And Rusheng had just made a 22-part series on the relationship between China and Africa. It was called Passions for Africa. It's actually shown on Phoenix TV, you know, every several months, actually. It was made for the 2006 FOCAC meeting. So my Chinese teacher said, oh, by the way, you know, my roommate made a film about China and Africa. And so it was just an amazing, like, China's such a big place with so many people that there are these small world occasions. It's quite remarkable. So I first met Rusheng in an ice cream parlor in Beijing. And I invited him kind of at the last minute to join me on an NEH collaborative research project as our cameraman. So when I do oral histories, I always use video as my record-keeping medium, because it captures people's facial expressions and the setting and all of that. I really like video rather than audio recording. And since Rusheng had this great experience, I said, look, why don't you just come along and be our videographer for the project? But what I found out right away from working closely with him was he became as much a part of the content of the whole project. He was no longer just taping. He was deeply influencing my methodology. We became kind of co-creators or co-storytellers. He was the visual storyteller. I'm more of the writer. But we just, working together was so generative. It was very, very creative. And after some months of working together, I asked him, would he be willing to be more of a full partner? So our plan then became that we would do the field work together, and then he would take that material and make a film, and I would take that material and write a book. And we even talked about not communicating during that process and see sort of how we each came back with the right material. And then I was so lucky to have a wonderful one-year fellowship in Berlin at the Humboldt University, the Institute for the Global Study of Labor. And they paid for Rusheng to come and spend 4 months with me. And we used those 4 months to just take our materials and see what we could do. So then we began working with this kind of short subject or short story idea. We began to create short films and short stories about sort of sites or places that we had worked, and then around stories of individual narrators or storytellers. So we've moved a little bit away from the old documentary film idea, you know, a 90-minute film with a narrator, to a kind of maybe a mosaic of short subjects. That's kind of where we are now, but we're still working together.
Still working and thinking about it.
Yeah.
How would you compare the experience of doing oral history or even traditional archival work with filmmaking?
Well, what's really interesting is that Rusheng is an oral historian filmmaker, so his work has always been about doing oral history, and so his method is really aimed at creating a kind of an empathetic and safe space in which a narrator will really become articulate in a very comfortable way. And this takes time. So what Rusheng has done, for example, doing something so painful as the history of land reform in China, he went and spent 3 years over time just living in a village until people got so comfortable with him that they began to kind of spill the stories. So we started using that method, which was completely different from how I had worked in the past. So we would go and live with worker families for weeks and not do any official research at all, but just live there, get comfortable, and living in the neighborhood of other worker families, and then kind of let the stories be told. But what I really found exciting was what happened when the camera was there. So at first the camera made me uncomfortable. I wasn't quite sure how that would be. And over time, like Rusheng would be behind me filming while I would be interviewing someone. And it created a kind of almost like a closed room where I somehow became much more patient and more empathetic. And we took a lot of time. And I have to say that the quality of the interviews is so much more, they're more deep. People go into subjects that I haven't heard people talk about in the past. So even if the film weren't becoming a film, just working with a filmmaker gave me a kind of oral history methodology that I was really attracted to, that I think continue to use. I am continuing.
Yeah, so in a sense it enhanced your historical methods.
Very much.
Did you find, I know that in Tanzania there's a research permitting process, which I've been through, and I imagine there would be in China, so was this subject matter at all politically charged in either context, or were both countries pretty open about you pursuing your research?
In Tanzania, I don't have any political issues or difficulties with my research, although I do, it is the case that, interestingly, the Tazara Railway has its own, in a sense people say it has its own government, because it's not within either Tanzania or Zambia, so it has a binational governing authority. So I had to get permission from the Tazara Railway Authority as well as the Tanzania and Zambia governments. And that was hard for a long time, but once my first book came out, I think people understood what I was doing, and I think people were very welcoming of my work. So in China, my experience there is kind of mixed. Usually when I work in China with railway workers, directly one-on-one, I have a really great experience. But there are times when the official railway bureau or some other government officials would want me to kind of go through them and have more official interviews where they can be present. So I've had different experiences in those settings. But my last trip to China, I felt that there was a lot of people I think are getting to know me and know my work better. My first book is coming out in Chinese. So I think there's just a better awareness of what I'm doing, and that makes it easier.
And it makes it easier. Would you characterize the work you're doing as transnational history, global history, international history? We use these labels sometimes interchangeably. Comparative history maybe. How would you define what you do?
I really think of myself as a global historian, and here's why I don't think of myself as a transnational historian. Because I work on, well, somehow the idea of transnational or comparative history ends up being reductive in my view. So people imagine it as a comparison of, say, apples and oranges. So you've got this nation and that nation, and then you're either comparing them or understanding a relationship between them. So my project, first of all, has 3 different countries that were partners. But because I'm looking at technopolitics in the Cold War, as you saw in my talk yesterday, I've got there are global networks, global actors, global entanglements that are affecting my project, and my project is also affecting these global dynamics. So building this railway caused a lot of kerfluffle in South Africa, for example. The U.S. was alarmed and was building this road, right alongside the railway in this Cold War competition. In fact, the road building AID, American contractors, and the Chinese workers had a conflict over one bridge site during this time. So that's sort of part of it. And then the other, on the Chinese side, then the whole railway technopolitics on the Chinese side in the 60s and 70s had to do with the Vietnam War. It had to do with the Sino-Soviet split. And with internal political issues within China that had to do with China's larger regional presence in issues related, for example, to Tibet or ethnic minority groups. So the project, I think any project, if you do it deeply enough, will move. If it's a project that crosses these kind of boundaries, it will move into this more global context. Even if you don't start there, I think that would eventually be the outcome.
And it sounds like this one allows you to ask questions you wouldn't have asked otherwise of your materials.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. So I can go to the UN and see a little ivory sculpture, and the whole world is in that sculpture, literally.
That makes sense,
and
right?
And it's in the whole world. It's in the United Nations. So it's an exemplar. It's a model to the world of something very small in China. One train, and then that train itself is an outcome of the whole world's kind of relationships at that Cold War moment.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I work, I guess, is to go from maybe small or local, very close, very empathetic work to see these larger global relationships.
You teach at Macalester College. You once were at Carleton College, my alma mater. And Macalester is really well known for its international studies program and its internationally focused students, and many of them go into the Peace Corps, into international work. So how do you bring this into your teaching? So we tend to teach along national lines in history still, or geographic lines. But when you want to offer perspectives that don't fit in those categories, how do you do that? How do you label courses? How do you bring this into the classroom?
Well, that's very interesting too, because a couple of ways. So I do work at Macalester that's outside the classroom, related to what we call global citizenship. And in our own department, like what you're doing with your history program, we, in the last several years, have been making our own kind of global turn. So a couple ways that we've done that. We have a course on world history, but we're also framing quite a large number of our middle level topics courses around what I call global encounters in history. So global encounters in history is a kind of rubric, and then in that rubric I've just started offering a course on China and Africa. And that is really interesting for me, because as a historian, I usually start from the beginning, wherever I imagine that to be. So it took me back to like 8th century Guangzhou, where the first Africans and the first understanding of African as a kind of blackness or otherness is starting to show up in documents in Chinese ports. And I go from there all the way through interactions between coolie laborers and African slaves on Caribbean sugar plantations, in the Indian Ocean world, all the way into the Bandung era, and then and even colonialism. There, as we talked about yesterday, there were some Chinese laborers brought to places like the Congo to do labor, much like they came to the west coast of the United States. So that was a really fun course for me to do. I hadn't done that before, taken my China-Africa work and tried to think about it as a global history course. And it was hard. It was really hard because my students didn't really have a background in Chinese history or African history. So helping them get the foundation they needed to understand, for example, how did 改革开放 or economic reform in the 80s in China change China's Africa policy? Some of them didn't really understand what China had been before, which was communist China. They had so little background. So teaching in an American university, however high quality, dealing with the under preparation of students for global studies, that's a challenge, and I'm not quite sure how I'll work with that in the future.
What would you, if you were speaking to a graduate student, let's say, and she were launching her dissertation project, what advice would you give about the global or the global studies in thinking about new research topics, regardless of maybe where the person starts?
Well, it's interesting because our department at the moment is hiring new faculty members, and we want all of our new faculty to be global. But I think what we mean by that is not as large as it might appear to those who read our advertisements. So what I would say, first of all, like I would say to any of my students, is that you're going to have a successful and rewarding career if you follow your passions and follow what you find really attracts your intellectual curiosity. And my experience is that takes us often into the global anyway. So my earlier work as an Africanist actually took me into German newspapers, because I was working on a colonial war in German East Africa between, of course, Germans and East Africans, Tanzanians. And a lot of what happened during that war, in my view, took place because of rumor and speculation about in the context of like the fog of war. And so as I followed my curiosity about rumors, I found, those rumors went from Africa to Germany and back again. So I'm already in the entanglement and interconnection of Germany and Africa. So I don't always think about colonial histories as transnational, because colonies and their colonial masters were not really nations in that sense. If you think of colonialism as a broader process. However, I do think that there are ways you can think of colonial histories as global. And so I would say to graduate students, follow your intellectual curiosity, and you will probably find that the bounds of nation states and national histories are not going to be enough for you to work within. And the fact that you don't have to anymore is so liberating.
Yeah.
And if you look at the exciting methodologies and theories that are coming out today, they are coming from people like Ann Stoler or people who are working on these more global topics. And so I think it's an exciting time to be a graduate student, because it's open. And I can see how it can also be disconcerting, because it doesn't have a template that you can easily follow. But I think that our next generation of historians will be just in a way perhaps organically be more global in their scholarship.
And maybe we should rename this the Entanglements of Global History.
Yeah.
That sounds like a better label based on our conversation today.
Yeah.
Which I'm really grateful for. And thank you. This has just been a pleasure talking with you today.
You're welcome.